Hey, everybody, and welcome. This is Craig from the University of Applied Research and Development, and it is our delight and honor to have Dr. Monica Burns here with us today, who's coming off mute and going to join us for our very first live broadcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Good morning, Monica.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today.
I'm excited that you're here because 12 months ago, nearly to the day, you were one of the very first people that we did our UARD Educators broadcast. It's great to be able to launch our live version with you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here with you. It has been quite the year, and so catching up and talking together today is definitely a highlight.
So you said it's been quite the year. Now, we all know what that means with the COVID pandemic and all the changes and impacts that that brought on education, on business, and the world in general. So for you, before, pre-COVID, what were you doing? What was life like for you as an educator, a trainer?
Yeah, so I started my career in the classroom. So I was teaching in New York City for several years before I transitioned around 2014 to doing professional development and writing and speaking around education technology topics. And so the past 5 years or so, leading up to last March when we spoke, I was traveling a lot all over the place to schools and districts, small regional events, conferences that were more of a national or sometimes an international audience. And so that very much stopped when everything was put on pause. I'm based on the East Coast, right outside of New York City. So we went into a lockdown very quickly, probably a little bit earlier than in some other places. That was kind of the energy at the time. And so this year has been very different in terms of the ways that I support schools and teachers and educators in different roles over the past year.
Now, when we spoke for our very first interview, you had just gone into lockdown in your area. I was in Indonesia and you were in New York. And I guess that must have changed things very, very quickly for you. So what were some of those changes that you went through as a business person, as a consultant, as an educator?
Yeah, so just the week before or so that we probably spoke, I went to Seattle to speak at an event when it looked like Seattle might be the center of things here in the States. Wasn't sure if I should go. I ended up going. I kept the schedule and came back on a very empty flight to New York, which ended up being much more of an epicenter, if you will, than anyone had anticipated at that time. And so right away when I came home from Seattle, the energy there was very different. And New York was only starting to feel that way, but you could feel that it was coming pretty quickly. And so just in terms of shutdowns and changes. And so pretty much right away after I landed on around the 8th or 9th of March, it was an overnight flight. So I say both of the dates, right? I knew right away that things were going to change very quickly, and they did, right? So events like South by Southwest, ASCD Empower, I was supposed to be on the West Coast just a couple days after arriving home from Seattle. So as those things were happening, I tried very hard to provide as many resources as I could to anyone who was asking. If I look back at the podcast episode I recorded right then, I think the title was something like Just Two Things to Do, which was basically like focus in on what you can actually do right now and not worry about all the other things that are out of your control. We're in a major health crisis, let alone dealing with this transition to schools closing. So many of the schools that I supported closed right away, and then everyone else very shortly after. So at that point, it was really about making sure I was available to give some resources, to ask questions. And then with everything that I had on the schedule for the school year, really canceling essentially, or let's put on pause and talk about what we might do a month from now. Because as much as I, in that moment in New York, felt like this is going to be a couple months, I think a few, people were also, maybe it's just 2 weeks, right? So everyone was kind of navigating what it was going to look like for them moving forward. So it was a lot of quick pivoting, sharing resources, and putting on pause some of the other engagements that had been on the calendar.
Wow. And so for me, a year later, moving my entire family and the university back to New Zealand, coming home like you on a flight which was pretty empty. I was very careful with my luggage to make sure that I was under the limit. Then I arrived and people were putting on 10 times the limit because there was no one else on the plane. And I just looked around and thought, wow, this is a very, very different world. So many people have had to change business, change the way that they do their job. Some people have had to change jobs because their job couldn't translate to
Yeah.
working from home. And some of us have the privilege and the honor of being able to do that. Many of us don't have that. So for you, dealing with the leaders that you talk to, the training that you do at a leadership level and for educators in the classroom, what are some of those challenges and some of those responses that you've been working through with people that you've seen people had to
So,
grapple with?
yeah, so when it comes to the professional development that I offer, I've always done the majority on site and live, physically in a space, sharing with others. Webinars have been part of something I've done for a very long time, almost maybe 7 or 8 years. That's been part of the puzzle of things that I do for professional development. But this year, transitioning into fully remote for supporting technology integration while folks were at home, often navigating many different things, let alone being in a virtual space for the first time. One of I would say, the kind of big pivots was thinking through how to communicate, how to support, how to model best practices within a tech-friendly or tech-rich environment, but then also being mindful of just the external pressures, the challenges, the Zoom fatigue, which might have been, was not a word we were using last March or April, but is one now that is very much part of what I try to acknowledge when doing sessions, balancing synchronous and asynchronous instruction, just like we would for students. These are all the kind of things I'm talking about with school, district, organization leaders, especially now as they're thinking forward to say, what is professional development going to look like in the future?
Yeah, and I noticed that you said something earlier about you promoted to people what are the two things that you need to do now, and you gave a lot of resources away. And I've noticed many people who are in the business space, who are entrepreneurs, who run their own company, such as yourself.
Mhm.
Many people made that shift of I'm going to serve on the biggest level I possibly can, serve other people, expect nothing in return because people are struggling. And you
Yeah.
made that shift. So what were some of those things that you had to do for yourself to enable yourself to maintain that perspective and that momentum, so that you can serve others? Because as we give, we become drained. We're giving of ourselves. How did you maintain that momentum for yourself?
I mean, it was definitely an exhaustive spring, right, to say the least. And I'm not the only person who is in that position. Everyone has had a very challenging year, and whatever that means for them, right? And so, I would say that, acknowledging that, it's been tough for so many people. I think for me, coming into the spring of last year, thinking about ways to support folks, it really was about maintaining some level of understanding of what my bandwidth was, but then also feeling like I didn't have many other options if I really wanted to be as supportive as possible. So just really going kind of to that limit, like many people were and still are in many situations, right? Until you kind of reach that moment of pause. And I feel like for me, that was really March, April, May, and then June, being able to say, okay, now that there's a better sense, if what's going on, now is a moment to step back and maybe plan a little bit more strategically. So with my work, that just meant making sure I was continuing to be very consistent with content, so there wasn't any content disruption. I haven't missed many Tuesdays unless it's been a holiday for new episodes of my Easy EdTech podcast, and just reached 100 of those episodes a couple weeks ago. Same thing with blog content. And one thing that I tried to do last spring was just host more webinars or jump into more virtual learning experiences that I thought might be helpful. I did one for ASCD, who's the publisher of my book, Tasks Before Apps, and a book that I have coming out this summer. So I did a webinar for them where we had over 3,000 people join live, and thousands more in this past year watch the recording. So really just trying to provide value and balancing that, which I think is challenging. I come from a elementary teacher background, and I try to be positive and all those things, but also making sure that is offset with being mindful of not the toxic positivity or everything's fine mentality, because everything is not fine. And that is different for different people, not only from a professional standpoint, but from the personal challenges that they've had this year as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you brought in there about that toxic positivity. I know that whenever I walk into an environment, people may say, "How are you?" And I say, I'm incredible. I can't believe how incredible I am. And I do that because it gets a laugh and it engages with them and it lifts the atmosphere. But there's that pause as leaders that we need to make as well to actually sample the temperature in the room of the people and see how they are. And so for you, I noticed that when we did a number of seminars actually in Nepal using Zoom, we wanted to promote some resources. Your response was instantly yes. It was yes. Yes, I can give my resources. Yes, I can add people to my mailing list. Yes, I can give this away for your people, your educators in Nepal who are struggling and grappling with just how do we turn this device on, let alone how do we deliver excellent education. And so your generosity was really noticeable. And I do want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. You helped us. You helped hundreds of schools in Nepal to have extra resources through your leadership and your generosity. I think it was a really good model and a great example, Monica, of how educators can share what they have, how leaders can share who they are as well. And you're going to be coming up pretty soon on the Device Impact Management Summit, the Measurement Summit. And that's an interesting title, isn't it? Do you think that devices have had a measurable impact on learning outcomes for students?
Well, thank you so much for your kind words. I think it's, this year more than ever, and that commitment to providing resources, and then those extra things, right? The monetization component, the other pieces can come along, right, alongside of that. And so events that I've done this past year, including the one this Friday, which is in partnership with the folks at Dino, which is all about device impact management. I am excited about that topic because I think it's an important moment now, whether it's short term for the end of this year, school year, at least here in the States, right, ending up in the next few months. And as we look forward into the fall, or if you're mid-year, right now, or making some different choices, it's kind of always a good time to step back and look at the data and say, what is actually going on here? If we invested in something, do we really need to keep it up? Are we actually using it? Sometimes it feels like we're using something, and until we step back and really put the minutes to it, it's not quite the same data that we real, just because that we have that kind of, the gut feeling. I could tell you, I don't think I look at my phone that much, but then every week when I get that weekly report from Apple that says how many hours I've spent on my phone that week, right? And it feels, like that's the data. Those numbers aren't lying to me there. And so, this idea of device impact management, I think, is really compelling for school leaders to take a look and say, all right, if we are all using this thing, how can we make sure our professional development supports this so that there's a level of retention for this type of activity? Or if we are all going to, what's the reason we're not using this thing that we really feel is important? We put dollars behind it. We really want to, we never had any support or training, or nobody really knows how this works. And I thought everyone knew how this worked, but maybe that's the reason. So I think it gives some information to spark conversations. I don't think it should be a one and done decision making. Here's the data, here's what we're going to do. I think it's a part of the puzzle of having a conversation around next steps and moving forward. And it can really inform conversations and decision making.
I think every leader, every business person, regardless of the industry, can do exactly what you said, which is look at the data and what's it really telling you, because we do have our assumptions and we see through lenses. We have our own perspectives, and the truth is actually in the numbers. Let's have a look at that, because I think in different businesses and different industries, because it's so cost intensive and it's profit driven, you have to notice the impact and the change. Do you think in education, predominantly owned by governments, funded centrally, do you think that there has and there will be going forward an impact on the way schools operate, the way that learning happens based on this experience of the last year?
Well, one thing that I've been talking to a lot this past week, actually on Monday, I did a session for a group of educators in Virginia where we tackled this idea of avoiding nostalgia. And that's really the term that I've been using to talk about some of those pieces, right? If we are really going to move forward purposefully, if we are going to reflect and look back, it's really easy for us to get back into patterns because they feel good and they feel comfortable, especially after a very traumatic year. We probably all can think to a holiday celebration in our own family where we don't know why we do it this way, but we've always done it this way, right? And maybe some older relative can tell us who started that part of the tradition, but we don't even question it because we do it, even if it might be silly. It just makes us feel good and warm and all of that, right? Well, this is an opportunity for us to say, why do we do that thing? Like, why have we always had this routine or this expectation? Is it really rooted in best practices? Maybe it is. And maybe when we run back to in-person instruction, there's a reason why that thing is so important that we do. But it's also a time to really take a step back and avoid some of that nostalgia piece. We have an opportunity to really plan and prepare for the unknowns that are now knowns, right? We could not have anticipated in any real way the scope of this. When you and I met last year, right, we were not having 6 months of prep time to prepare for a day. This day just came, and you can make arguments about that in terms of preparation, but realistically, there just was not the infrastructure or the expectation to be prepared for this emergency shift to remote learning. Well, now there should be an expectation that this is something that we could turn on and off. There might need to be an extended holiday break where there's 2 weeks of remote learning, of a buffer before people come back to school. And if that means making a commitment to, say, a platform, a hub, a learning management system in a way that we didn't in the past, well, now we might focus energy on that as a way to distribute information, build some routines, so that if we have to scale something in one direction or the other, there's a different level of preparation and comfort and confidence with all members of a school community.
So you talked about the two things. What are the two things that someone could do to just deal with what happened a year ago? What would you say are the two things that educational leaders could do to maximize this opportunity that we have to bring a change?
Yeah, well, I think really focusing in on the essentials and not getting overwhelmed with the noise. Last year, this time, with the best of intentions, right, many ed tech companies released all of their stuff, right, all their trials, all their logins for free, and it became this, fire hose of information that was great in many situations, right? It gave people access to things, which was wonderful, but it also became very overwhelming. So I would say one big thing is to notice, what are your essentials? What do you really want to get out of an experience with student learners with or without technology? And then the other piece would really be around keeping it simple. So I think these two kind of go hand in hand, right? Prioritizing, focusing on your essentials, and then stepping back to keep it simple and doable for all members of your school community. Keeping things as streamlined as possible, everyone going to a similar place, doesn't necessarily take away teacher agency or choices for other things that might happen, but it really has everyone with a common vocabulary and conversation so that everything's anchored in one spot, and then those other things can go around it.
That's really great. I do hope that people were making notes. I always tell our students in our Masters of Education program to take notes. So I've got my book full of notes as you've been talking. Do you want to highlight a couple of things for people? You said to avoid nostalgia. I really like that. We can always look back at how things were, and it was all so wonderful. And yet we do have this opportunity for change. Look at the data. Love that. Number 3, as you've done, to give. You said at the beginning, what are the two things you can focus on during this time of challenge and trauma and change? But again, coming out of that, what are the two things we can do? And that's to focus on the essentials. And then number 2, to keep it simple for people as well. I think that's really great wisdom. Monica, how can people engage with you and access your resources going forward?
Well, to learn more about my work, everything is on my website, classtechtips.com. So if you're looking to connect with me or attend an event, I've got a big events calendar on there too. So you can find there. That's also where you can find my Easy Ed Tech podcast, which is also on all the podcast places if you've got a favorite app for that. And then at Class Tech Tips is my social media handle right here on the screen. So that's where you can find me on Twitter or Instagram, and even Clubhouse is a place that I've been using for conversations the past few months to connect with other educators.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Monica Burns, really want to thank you for your time. I'm delighted that we could cycle back to this new format with our first person from the original video cast, and to have you back for the launch of this new format as well. Be safe, and thank you very much for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me today.